In the beginning, there was Adam and Eve. Then Adam and Eve. As we question and learn, LGBTQ has become LGBTQQIAAP2SAA, and more letters will certainly be added in the future. If you think this is too much, this episode is for you. If you are struggling and questioning your own gender and sexuality, this episode is for you. The chant, "We're here, we're queer, we're not going away," has never been more poignant and more true. Put your objections on hold for a few minutes. Adam and Eve, It's Complicated, right now on Try to Keep Up. The Village in Toronto is where we are today, Canada's largest LGBTQ community. The rainbow's here in sharp contrast to the gray days back in 1981, the infamous bathhouse raids. Hundreds of mainly gay men charged by police with being found-ins of a common body house. This event actually galvanized Canada's LGBTQ community into action. The 519 is the heart of this community. Here I am talking with Jack Hickson-Volpe, a senior consultant of special projects. They are an advocate, especially for policy and trans rights. Hello, Jack.
Hello.
I said they are. Yes. So explain that to the audience.
Yeah. So they, them they're examples of gender neutral pronouns. So often when we think of pronouns, which we can think of name replacements when we're talking about someone in the third person, and the ones that we most often hear are gendered pronouns, such as she and her and he and him. So they and them is an example of a gender neutral pronoun. So for me, what that means is that I don't feel particularly comfortable with gendered pronouns. I don't identify as a woman or a man. So using gender neutral pronouns is a way for me to kind of demonstrate that and have that respected. And so by using they and them in reference to me, you're kind of understanding my identity as not either necessarily a man or a woman.
So I want to emphasize that this is not new. We talk about all the different letters now. So it used to be lesbian and gay, and then it was LGBTQ, and then LGBTQQIAA, and the letters keep getting added.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people are saying, well, what's all this new stuff? It's not really new. We're just identifying it.
It's true. None of this is new. And also there's a very important part that you left out, the 2S, which stands for Two-Spirit, which is in reference to Indigenous communities. So I think that's a really new, really important part that's, again, not new, especially not new to Canada, considering we are on Indigenous land. So when we think about acronyms, they continue to grow, recognizing that there are so many identities that have always been there. And so this is an opportunity for people to be reflected in the acronyms that we use when we're thinking about representing LGBTQ2S communities. And there is no right or wrong acronym necessarily. I think it's just an understanding that you need to know what the acronyms stand for. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and Two-Spirit. That's what we use predominantly at the 519. But lots of other organizations use different ones. So again, it's about understanding the populations that you're actually talking about and reflecting that in the language that you're using.
There's a bit of an irony here, because I think the important thing in the message that gets across when we talk about this community is don't label us, but we're searching for labels right now for people.
Yeah. So labels are really important. They're important for people to define them themselves. I get to define myself just as you get to define yourself.
Why
do I get to define myself?
Exactly. And I'm not being facetious with that question. Well, why?
Because it's my life. Because I have a right to say who I am. No one has that right to define me. We experience that every day when people are walking through the world. People want to be called Mr. or Miss. They want a particular name used for them. And we should respect that because it allows someone to actually be who they are in the world and allows them to go through the world with ease and recognizing that other people care about them. So it's only often when we see people that don't kind of fit a social norm that all of a sudden a desire for a particular name or for a particular pronoun becomes an issue. But if someone fits that social norm, then we're happy to use that name. If someone gets married and they change their last name, we're happy to respect that. But if someone wants to change their name because they're coming out as trans or they're coming out as a woman or they're somehow changing their gender identity, that's when it becomes a huge conversation and people have to pay to have their name changed. They have to go through all of these systems where if you change your name because you've got married, it's actually free and it's quite simple. So when we see these barriers thrown up, it's about who gets to label who, and often folks have don't actually have the ability to label themselves. So when we do take that option to label ourselves and we do actually carve that space out, as you said, we have fought for our rights. So when we take that place and we label ourselves, it's taking power away from those who have labeled us. And so that's why it's so important for us to have that space, because we have spent so much of our lives and our history and our communities have been labeled by others. When we get to self-define, it's incredibly powerful.
I don't want any of my questions to seem ignorant, but I want to ask some questions that I just want to hear some answers to. And one of them is that I thought things had progressed nicely with the gay community. Gay marriage is now not only legal, it's accepted. Adoption, and when someone comes out, like, personally, I'm not thinking it's a big deal anymore. I mean, not since Ellen came out, really, have we really been that much, concerned about someone coming out. Am I right? Am I wrong?
For some folks, coming out has always been easy. For some folks, their family has always been supportive. And for other folks, it has been hard, and it continues to be quite difficult. And so I think that there have been societal shifts where we have seen something like gay marriage change. We have seen rights in terms of same-gender couples being able to adopt. But the reality is when we pull it out and we look at the broader picture, especially when we think about globally and when we think about what's going on in the United States specifically, recognizing that rights are granted, but then those rights can be taken away from us. And we actually see those rights being taken away from us in the United States. And we see some of that happening in Canada when it comes to some of the conversations about the sex ed repeal, that we're actually going to see LGBTQ2S identities no longer being talked about within sex ed classes, I think is a really important thing for us to consider. So changes are happening, but we kind of see that one step forward, two steps back, or as I like to think of it, we're not really moving, we're kind of laterally kind of dancing around, and we actually haven't made the systemic changes that we need in order for the change to actually last. So again, we can think about what it means to be granted rights, but how those rights can be taken away from us.
I want to talk about depression and anxiety, because that's, where I have the most concern for people and concern for the future. And the numbers when it comes to the gay community are astounding, especially when it comes to trans, where bisexual and trans people are overrepresented among low-income Canadians. Half of trans people, and this is from Rainbow Health Ontario, half of trans people live on less than $15,000 a year.
Yeah.
An Ontario study found that 20% had experienced physical or sexual assault because of their identity. Higher rates of depression and anxiety. In fact, 77% of trans respondents in an Ontario survey had seriously considered suicide. 45% had attempted it. And I think in the gay community, especially when someone is questioning, that maybe that number translates into other parts of the gay community as well.
One thing I just want to call out right now is that you use the term gay community, and this is in reference to a sexual orientation, and this tends to be thought of when we use the term gay only in reference to men. So I'm going to really encourage, we talked about acronyms, we can talk about our community as LGBTQ2S communities. So that way we're not just talking about sexual orientation, but again, we're kind of bringing it out to the larger picture. As you said, trans individuals are at higher rates live in higher rates of poverty, are at higher rates of potential suicidality. The bisexual community, also very similar stats that we see. So when we say the gay community, we're actually narrowing our focus, when what we should be doing is we should be pulling out and recognizing that the experiences of gay people is different than the experiences of bisexual people, is different than trans folks. And then especially when we bring in the conversation of what it means to have multiple kind of marginalized identities, so what it means to be a person of color, what it means to be Indigenous, what it means to be living with a disability, all of these things influence individuals' experiences of suicidality, of depression, of anxiety. So when we think about these stats, we really need to bring that into the conversation and recognize that it's just not just one singular identity, but we're talking about a multitude of experiences and identities.
You're going to get pushback on that, you understand. People are going to say, oh, another name, another acronym. How do you deal with that? Why can't we just call you the gay community and leave it at that?
I think it's important to recognize that, again, when we're talking about the gay community, we are talking about a particular community. So we need to actually be accurate in our language. And so when we talk about the gay community, when we mean LGBTQ2S communities, or when we mean the trans community or trans communities or two-spirit communities or bi communities, we actually need to make sure that we're using accurate language, because we're not actually talking about the things that we need to talk about. And accuracy is important, and we talk about the importance of stats and all of these things. So how can we then push back on that when we're asking for accuracy and proper representation in other parts of the world? We're providing those options and some of those answers and those explanations as to, if you want to talk about LGBTQ2S communities and our experiences, you actually need to use the proper language to reflect who we are.
You've heard it all, right?
Yes.
You've heard it all. And what is the biggest wall that you come up against? And I want you to narrow it down. I bet you come up against a lot of walls.
Yep.
What is the one thing that you find yourself arguing more than anything else?
I don't know if there's necessarily one thing. I feel like maybe the overarching thing that I can identify is the recognition that regardless of how someone has come into our communities, that their experience is valid, that no one has to be a particular type of gay or queer or trans, but that anyone is welcome to come into our communities when they have gone through kind of their life process and their life changes to understand who they are. And so I think people often have this idea that, oh, you were born this way. We hear a lot of that rhetoric. And that someone needs to somehow prove that they are LGBTQ2S. We see that happen with our governments, where newcomers and refugees come in and they have to prove that they are they have to somehow prove that they are LGBTQ. And that's a really difficult thing to prove.
But they don't have to prove they're heterosexual.
Never. They never have to prove that they're straight or that they're cisgender necessarily, but they have to prove that they hold this marginalized identity. And how do you do that? Do you have to hold the hand of somebody? We should be able to hold anybody's hand.
I think one of the most important things to try and explain might go a long way in understanding, and that is that sexuality, sex, and gender are not all one in the same thing.
Yeah, they're all 4 distinct characteristics, and this is according to the Ontario Human Rights Code. So the Ontario Human Rights Code defines sex as what we were assigned at birth. And so we have terms like male and female. And then when we think about gender identity, which we can think of as an aspect of gender identity is that internal, personal sense of self, whereas sex is something, again, that's assigned at birth by a medical professional. Gender identity is our self-defined understanding of who we are. And this is where we see terms like man and woman, trans, cisgender, genderqueer, non-binary, two-spirit. We see a lot of terms that reference this idea of I get to define who I am. And then we also have gender expression, which is also a protected characteristics underneath the Ontario Human Rights Code. Gender expression is kind of that public sense or that public presentation of who you are. It includes things like hair and makeup and voice, because we make a lot of assumptions based on the pitch of someone's voice. And so that's gender expression. And gender identity and gender expression, I like to say, kind of come together to create the social understanding of gender. So we have this idea of one is not born a woman, but one becomes a woman. And then finally, we have sexual orientation, which is who you are attracted to, who someone wants to spend their life and their time with. This may involve a sexual relationship. It may not necessarily involve a sexual relationship. And so that's where we see language such as gay, lesbian, bi, queer is in reference to a sexual orientation, where we have gender queer, which is in relation to a gender identity. So we can understand that these are actually 4 very distinct characteristics, though we do see them kind of lumped together when we talk about LGBTQ2S communities. And so we can recognize that there is an importance in these communities working together and supporting each other and working in solidarity, but we're still talking about vastly different experiences. So when we ask someone, do you identify as LGBTQ2S, we're asking about a gender identity and sexual orientation in the same breath, when we really need to be bringing that apart.
Are we defying nature by this? Is it? I mean, nature has males and females born. We see it in the animal world. We see it in the human world. Are we in any way sort of screwing around with nature?
I think when we go in and make decisions for people without their consent, that's the problem that we should be looking at. We shouldn't be necessarily thinking about nature, that we do see kind of intersex experiences occurring naturally throughout the entire world, throughout the animal world, throughout the human world. These are very natural things. Same with experiences of queerness, same with the experiences of transness. We see lots of different variations happening. Again, when we think about how we have been forced to engage in a particular way, as everyone is either a man or a woman and you're supposed to be straight, that's when we're really actually, in my opinion, deviating from the reality of what nature has provided us.
Give us a report card. Give Ontario a report card. Give Canada a report card, and give the world a report card on how we are doing with the LGBTQ2S community.
That is a very difficult report card.
So what grade would you give Ontario?
What grade would I give Ontario?
Now, we've had a populist government elected. Mm-hmm. We have had, as you say, the repeal of the sex education. But we still have a very strong lobbying group for the LGBTQ2S community.
Yeah.
So what's our grade?
So
not the province, not the government. I just mean in general Ontario.
Okay. So for me, I want to focus on the communities that exist and the communities that are fighting and that are doing amazing work. And I would have to give us an A+, because we are constantly there. We are constantly ready to face a new battle. We are always there to support each other. And I think that's the most important thing, is that we are ready at the drop of a hat to be there, to try and fight and to try and recognize the humanity that we all hold and see that in each other.
What about the province? So when you get outside of Toronto, and you're going into the, into the northern Ontario, mm-hmm. into southwestern Ontario, eastern Ontario, how in general are people doing?
I would again give it an A+.
Great.
Because everywhere you go, you are going to find someone, you're going to find community that loves and supports you and is going to fight for you. I know that often we think of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia as something that happens outside of urban spaces, that it's more likely to happen in rural spaces. And I think that is very untrue. I think the reality is that homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia exist everywhere. Just as queer people and trans people, we exist everywhere. So we will find resistance to our experiences everywhere we go. So I think it sets up a false dichotomy when we say that urban spaces are safe and rural spaces are not safe. And we really need to challenge that and ensure that communities can stay together in rural spaces. And we have LGBTQ2S people staying in rural spaces because they belong there, because we are everywhere.
Can I suggest that you're going to give Canada an A+ because you have a prime minister that is, who considers himself not only a feminist, but a defender of LGBTQ rights?
So again, I'm going to pull out, and I don't really want to focus on the government in this respect. I'm going to go back to focusing on our communities, because our communities stay while governments change. And so we will always be there regardless of what government says they are or aren't doing. We will be the ones actually holding them accountable and changing the environment and moving that dial. Is
the world moving backwards with the populism and with the more right-wing kind of attitudes that seem to be prevailing in not only in the US, but now we're seeing it in Europe a lot more? Is there a fear that we're stepping backwards?
I think there is a fear that particular views are getting more air, and they're getting more kind of airtime and press time, and they're getting a lot more interest that way. Whether or not that is actually becoming a dominant view, I really question that. I think again, we go back to the fact that communities are continuing to fight and are continuing to be strong and continuing to hold to each other. And I think that's what we really need to focus on, and really give that kind of the credit that is due.
I want to spend the last few minutes talking to people out there who are falling in the Q part, and that's not just queer, that's questioning. Whether they're young, whether they're old, whether they're seniors, which in itself is a unique situation, and it presents its own unique problems. And I want to talk about the families and the people around them. Perhaps they're resisting, perhaps they're supportive. So when you're questioning, like, it can be very confusing. You may want to keep it quiet. You feel like you're alone. You have no one to talk to. What can you say? And we're in a counseling room right now. And if someone came in here and said, I'm questioning and nobody's supporting me right now, what do you say to that person?
We draw out the fact that they are sitting in an LGBTQ2S community center, and LGBTQ2 people make up the staff here. We are the community that brings this place together, and we have all gone through that period of questioning, and so we have all come out of it. And folks who identify as cisgender and straight may have also gone through a period of questioning. It's not just LGBTQ2S people who question who they are. We all take an opportunity to go through that process, and we all come through it. And if we don't, that's the problem.
So this is a safe space. But what about if they don't have a safe space, or they don't feel they have a safe space? How do you sit in your bedroom by yourself? Where should you go?
I think that's one of the beauties of the internet and the online world, and the recognition also that we have resources that people can call. There's the Youth Line, which is an opportunity for folks who are questioning, who are, I believe, 29 and under, who can call this phone line, and they can connect with folks. And
stay tuned, because we're going to give that number at the end, and as well any other resources that would be helpful to someone. Let's talk. I want to talk too. Not enough is talked about the people around someone who's questioning, whether they're supportive or not. They're going through a lot of questions themselves. What did I do wrong? Or how can this be? Or how can I continue on in a relationship with this person? They need support as well, I find, and answers.
Yeah, so some folks talk about that as kind of, say if a parent has a child who is coming out, that parent is mourning the life that they assumed their child was going to have. And so when we pull back and we try and stop parents from assuming who their child is, then we can hopefully cut down on that mourning, and we can actually see this as a moment of celebration. And so there are resources for folks who are supporting someone who is coming out. So there are supports for folks who actually are wanting to support people, but I think it's also important that we still center the individual who's having the hard time. The person who is coming out is still the person who should be at the center of this, and we need to figure out how to kind of support people so that they can go back and support that individual who's coming out, and then the individuals who require support around that person can then go out. So we shouldn't be looking to the person who is coming out for support. Those people should be going to other folks and talking to other parents who have had children who have come out. There are so many online forums that folks can engage in. So when people start to actually do the research on their own, they can actually find that there are tons of places that they can go, and they can reach out to any number of counseling kind of services. Lots of different communities have counseling services that are working towards LGBTQ2S inclusion. So we can, again, begin to actually we can call on allies to do the research and the homework that they need to do in order to actually support LGBTQ2S individuals.
All right. Well, here's hoping that we're moving in the right direction, and that we're heading to a community and a world that is not only accepting of LGBTQ2S, but of all individuals and their beliefs. It reminds me, what was the saying that you've heard since the 70s? We're here, we're queer, we're not going away. And you know what? Didn't go away.
Not at all.
So and this community is not going away. Thank you very much for this time.
Thank you very much.
Find out how you can get confidential, non-judgmental peer support at youthline.ca or translifeline.org. The battle lines have been drawn. Millennials are lazy and would rather travel than work. Baby boomers have practiced a scorched earth policy for future generations. No two generations have ever been more adversarial towards each other. Next time on Try to Keep Up, baby boomer Kevin talks with millennial Winston C. about the battle of the ages, boomers versus millennials. For more episodes on Try to Keep Up, subscribe to the Kevin Frankish YouTube channel and click on notifications to stay up to date.